Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm ffinlo Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com, the land use news channel. The UK Planning and Infrastructure Bill has passed its first reading in the House of Commons, and many farmers have been dismayed by a clause that gives Natural England the power to acquire farmland compulsorily to meet its nature recovery objectives. That concern has been heightened further because compulsory purchases will be made at what the government is calling fair market value. In other words, at agricultural prices, excluding the hope value associated with sales for development or natural capital services. I'm joined by Rob Hindle from Rural Solutions and Gabriel Connor-Streich from Greenshank Environmental. Welcome both. Let's get straight to it. Rob, why are we talking about this?
Well, as you've just explained, this planning and infrastructure bill is moving quite rapidly through the legislative programme. And I just checked, and the second reading is due on Monday. And obviously after the third reading, it's off to the House of Lords. So it's going through the system quite fast, unless it gets delayed by other events in the next few weeks and months. And it is potentially has some big new issues and introductions for the countryside and for landowners and land managers.
Fantastic. And why is it important?
Well, it's important on a number of levels. I mean, it is one of the government's major initiatives to get stuff built, to get infrastructure projects delivered less cost, more quickly and more efficiently, to remove what have been identified as blockages to delivery from the planning system. So it's a major part of the government's growth agenda. And it also has significant implications for driving of funds into nature recovery if you're looking glass half full. But it also comes with quite material change on what we have been used to for quite a long time around understanding impacts, assessing impacts, and responding to impacts arising from development on protected sites and species, and how that will be done.
So is this going to affect any land that Natural England wants for absolutely anything? Can it just go and buy a piece of farmland because it feels like it to deliver any number of objectives, or is it more constrained?
No, I think the bill is very specific about the purpose for which Natural England can engage. Can trigger the nature restoration fund approach, and that has to be to address environmental impact arising from development on protected sites or species. And not only do they have to be able to demonstrate that their actions through the Nature Restoration Fund will address those impacts, they also have to deliver greater conservation outcome than would have been achieved if they did not take this approach.
And we're expecting this to replace, I can see, Gabriel, you want to come in. This is about replacing the current approach on nutrient neutrality as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's also kind of important to recognise that whilst the scope of this bill is quite large in terms of encompassing any impacts linked to the habitat regulations and the various bits of legislation that affect protected species and habitats, the intention to begin with anyway is not to go, one big bang and kind of get everything in one fell swoop. It seems very likely that nutrient neutrality will be the focus to begin with, and it then may sort of spread out to other sort of environmental planning obligations, as they're calling them, linked to protected species licensing and protected habitats issues, and that environmental delivery plans may be created for those issues kind of down the line. It feels like nutrient neutrality is probably going to be a bit of a test case, and they'll see how it goes, and they're taking quite a modular approach. So it's not going to be suddenly, Natural England running around trying to get land for all manner of different mitigations approaches.
Well, let's come into nutrient let's go into each of those sort of different aspects: nutrient neutrality, protected species, and sites later on. Before we do, though, let's get into the mechanics of it, Rob. So a bundle of questions for you. How will it work? Who's responsible? What's the delivery body? And who's going to be making the decisions or the recommendations at a local level?
Well, the short answer is Natural England. Natural England has the lead on this, according to the way the legislation is set out. Natural England answering to the Secretary of State, but essentially Natural England as the driving body for this. It'll be Natural England that determines whether there will be impacts arising from development proposed in local development plans. It will be Natural England that decides whether that means they should look to create these environmental delivery plans, where and why. It'll be Natural England that assesses, that works out how they're going to do it, what it's going to cost, what the charging structure is going to be through the levy to developers. And it'll be Natural England that has to assemble, that has to get access to the land, that has to organise the conservation measures that they say are required, deliver against those, monitor against those that delivery, and treat with developers, secure the levy, enforce against any issues, etc., etc. So back to the first answer to the question, Natural England.
And so, do we have a sense of the timeframes over which this might work? I mean, for example, are farmers just going to wake up one morning and find that they got a letter in the post saying that they're going to have some land bought off them, or is it going to be a process that takes place over a number of months or years, as far as there are sort of scoping reports and recommendations and consultations and all this sort of thing?
I think it will be a relatively slow process. That's one of the concerns I think that I and others have about this approach, is that it is going to be quite process heavy. It's going to take time, and there's going to be a series of steps within it that Natural England has to carry out its own assessments. It has to generate a baseline for the land it's proposing to use, has to create a monitoring scheme, it has to create a charging schedule, it has to set out the conservation measures it proposes to take. There is a consultation piece that is, according to the way the bill is drafted, is pretty focused on public bodies rather than private interests, but there is a consultation piece within it. They have to make a case to and convince the Secretary of State to give them an order. They have to set out a charging levy, charging structure, and then they have to get that charging structure essentially signed off. So there are a lot of steps to it. It's not going to happen overnight, and there's no definite causal link between the setting up of an environmental delivery plan and the compulsory purchase of land or rights over land to deliver it.
Maybe, Gabriel, you could just talk to us a little bit about how nutrient neutrality works at the moment. So at the moment, a development's about to take place. It's planning permission being sought for 6 new homes or 200 new homes. There is a nutrient loading, what would you call it? Assessment, a nutrient loading assessment, which takes place, which says that there is a certain amount of nitrogen or phosphorus that needs to be mitigated, and then the developer would look for farmers who are offering to use their land, to sell their land, to mitigate the impacts of that nitrogen and phosphorus loading. And so, where does Natural England come into that? Currently, is that process managed and run by a local authority that's responsible for planning in a particular region? And so at what point in this new sort of system is Natural England getting involved? Is there a process at local authority level that's going to trigger Natural England, or is Natural England just taking over the whole process?
I think at the moment it's not completely clear. I mean, what we're hearing is that they're likely to kind of try and roll this out initially as almost set of pilots in the areas that have nutrient neutrality rules where they haven't got as much of a functioning system in place. At the moment, there's a lot of sort of variations on a theme with respect to how nutrient neutrality is being delivered. We've got some places where there's a sort of some local authority intervention to either accrue and trade credits. Some places it's purely based on private market sales between landowners and developers. In other places, very limited areas, Natural England have their own scheme where they're bringing credits to the market and then selling them to developers. And then in some places, there's basically very little private market whatsoever because it just hasn't developed yet. So I think exactly what they're going to replace and where is really up in the air at the moment. It seems like people said the GDPs will come in places where currently there isn't necessarily a functioning market. And I think exactly what they're going to be doing is really also not particularly clear from what's written in the bill. So, I mean, on the one hand, it could be read as saying that Natural England are going to come in and basically do a lot of the delivery work themselves. They're going to be just tasked with developing all of these schemes, bringing them forward, effectively selling them, recouping the money, going again. But also we know from wording in the bill and kind of feedback that we've been getting a bit from people within DEFRA and MHCLG that there is an intention to use private market supply to feed into the requirements that are set out within these environmental delivery plans. And so I think, those of us in the sort of natural capital, particularly nutrient neutrality sector at the moment, are kind of sat here going, we don't exactly know what this means for us. We don't really exactly know whether or not it's going to be pretty much business as usual, but actually instead of selling directly to developers or selling to local authorities who are sitting on government pots of money and using them to administer the nutrient credits themselves, whether or not it's all just going to suddenly, or at least not all, but majority start running through this Natural England scheme set out in the Environmental Delivery Plan, or is the Environmental Delivery Plan going to end up more like biodiversity net gain statutory credits, like a kind of point of last resort for developers, and then actually the current private market remains almost the sort of primary system for delivering environmental obligations for developers, and only where it's failing to deliver, there's this backstop solution via the EDP that a developer can use. I mean, all of these things are very, very unsure at the moment.
But the purpose is to speed up the whole process, isn't it?
Yeah, the purpose is to speed up the whole process in terms of making it more streamlined, saying just go pay the money and you're done.
Yeah, but the purpose, yes, indeed it is. That's the primary purpose, but also within the bill and the guidance is this talk of a better strategic approach, and that I think is goes back to, doesn't reference Lawton, but I think that probably goes back to Lawton bigger, better, joined up. I think that suggests that there is a view from Natural England and others that the way that the particular nutrient neutrality, but not the way this is being done at the moment, both nutrient neutrality and impact on protected species, is a series of isolated pepper potted approaches. That's not strategic. It's not bigger, better, joined up. Natural England think they can do a better job than that, and they think that they can make use. They can both unblock the process and get funding into a more strategic approach to mitigating these impacts and delivering over wider nature recovery than the way the current system works. So they're looking for a win-win, which I think does suggest that they're not looking at business as usual through another route. They're looking at doing something more strategic, bigger, more organised, more joined up. Quite whether that's achievable and quite how long it will take them to get organised to make it happen is a whole different set of questions.
Rob, this is very much a land-sparing approach, isn't it? So land being taken out of food production and then put into nature production. So, from one activity to a different activity. Is there any scope here for the two outcomes to be stacked at all?
I think, clearly land sparing is going to be, in some instances, the path of least resistance. I don't think it's necessarily the only approach. I think it's interesting that the bill talks of acquisition of land or new rights over land. I think there's definitely an expectation that there will be partnership working here. Natural England are not a delivery body; they'll be partnership working, and in some instances, I think that is likely to include a more multifaceted approach to land use and land management than pure land sparing. But it depends how joined up you think all this is. For example, if is this part of a strategy which sits alongside the land use framework, for example? So we know the land use framework is looking for a proportion of land. Some say 1/5, some X 15. Anyway, between 15 and 20% of land to come out of production in favour of nature recovery. Well, clearly this is part of a way that might be driven to happen. So I think you're right. I think fundamentally there is a land sparing element to this. I don't think it has to be exclusively land sparing, but it's certainly, for those that think land sparing is the wrong approach, there's certainly areas of concern you can find in here.
And Natural England doesn't have a great track record, I don't think, in terms of thinking in a joined up way, in terms of that sort of stacked approach, where there's no reason at all why you can't be grazing cattle in a regenerative way on land where you are also delivering nitrogen and phosphorus mitigation. But it doesn't really seem to be happening at the moment in terms of those nutrient neutrality sales.
I think part of the issue is that actually, in terms of taking that more joined up approach, I think Rob's right that is definitely kind of what's seemingly underpinning this is a bit of a thinking that can we do more than this sort of quite piecemeal approach that has already developed with respect to at least nutrient neutrality and to a degree BNG schemes. Although there are things within the BNG kind of system that try and push you towards doing things in slightly more strategic ways. But the fundamentals with nutrients, I think this will probably be something that will come out from protected species as well. Is that you kind of are beholden to a set of fairly random environmental characteristics that determine whether or not you can actually commercially do a scheme that will generate enough units. And there's lots of technicalities I'm not going to go into here, but the idea that you could kind of cherry pick areas that are meeting a whole bunch of other objectives and they also could be good for nutrients may not play out across the affected areas because of these geographical environmental characteristics that determine whether or not you do get enough nutrients to kind of make a nutrient neutrality scheme commercially viable. Now, I suppose this then does come on to the question of if it's not commercially viable on the basis of, well, this is the land value and then the hope value that landowners would want to actually bring a scheme into the market off their own back, do you end up going down the compulsory purchase route if they've decided actually this is the really perfect area? We don't care that we actually need more land than we would do if we located it somewhere optimal for nutrients, but we're going to do it anyway because we really want it for this nature restoration purpose. It's really not clear whether or not they're going to go, sort of try and take that approach. But I suppose, there is that could be a risk, and I think we need more clarity around when they say strategic. Like, is it going to be strategic in terms of having a better system that just delivers for developers more in a more streamlined way, or is it strategic in terms of nature restoration obligations and nature restoration ambitions, and therefore perhaps targeting land that isn't optimal in terms of nutrient mitigation potential?
We've already had more than half of our time, so I'm going to move on. But Gabriel, how much land are we potentially talking about, and where in the country would farm businesses be most at risk from this?
Just in a really basic analysis, and I will caveat by saying there's a lot of sort of flex around these figures, but if you're just taking agricultural land out of production, you tend to get somewhere between enough mitigation for somewhere between sort of 10 houses per hectare down to as little as half a house per hectare. And this is where these environmental characteristics I was talking about come into play. So just on that basis, every 1,000 houses, you could be needing anything from 100 hectares to 2,000 hectares. So there's a huge variation in the amount of land that might be needed, and that's really contingent on which catchment you're in. So way more land's needed in, for example, the Hampshire Avon catchment compared with the River Eden catchment, just because of the environmental characteristics. Probably you're going to end up finding there'll be an average that sits somewhere probably in the middle of that. So not entirely sure.
But we're talking about land around the country, aren't we? It's not that it's all sort of isolated in one particular county. There are lots of counties and lots of areas that are going to be affected.
Yeah, so there's a fairly big geographic spread across the south of the country, a smattering of locations in the Midlands, and then the River Tees and the River Eden catchment are affected. So that's quite a big chunk of the north, spreading across the northeast and northwest.
So potentially farmers really need to be, on their toes, thinking about this and listening to what's going on at local authority level, keeping an eye in the local papers, listening to farm clusters, that sort of thing, to find out if they're likely to be affected. Rob, the government says that proposals are not expected to have a substantive impact on the implementation of mandatory BNG. Now, I find that hard to believe, because although it may not have an impact on the overall policy delivery at a nationwide level, it could have serious restrictions placed on the ability of some farmers to take advantage of that higher value BNG market if they're instead forced to sell their land at agricultural market prices, i.e. without that hope value.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot in there, Finlo. I mean, I'm very wary of setting this scare train running that Natural England's coming for your land. I think that's not something we should be doing. I think we need to wait and see how this pans out. I think look, I'll come on to the BNG thing, but compulsory purchase has always been kind of the user of the negotiation ploy of last resort, and I think I think this is going to be a lot more limited in its application than a lot of people are worried about. But coming on to BNG, there's a couple of points here. So the bill is specific that it relates to harms to protected sites or protected species. Okay, that is a sort of a negative impact addressing point against specific things, which is already provided for in the planning system, which is already being delivered in the planning system, and they're saying we don't think it's very efficient. We want to free up this, help move things on. We're going to do this differently. BNG and impact mitigation for protected sites and species are two different things. BNG is an additional thing, obviously introduced more recently, and it's a separate and additional ask to addressing impacts on protected sites and species. There is nothing in the bill that talks to including BNG in this process. There is nothing in the guidance that talks to including BNG in this process. But here's the kicker. There probably are routes for that to happen if it was determined that there was benefit in that happening. And there is. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of the drafting, but it is. I think it is either worrying or instructive to when you look at when it talks about the cost of addressing conservation measures and how that's to be assessed. It talks about the actual expected cost of delivering the conservation measures. It talks about the viability of the development that's driving this as a factor, which is interesting, and that's as we are now. So that's not new, but it's interesting that that's still going to be a factor because this is about enabling development. It also has a third piece which talks about other actual or expected sources of funding. Now, if you want to be horribly cynical, you can say, well, that's BNG. We don't know. The jury's out. I think there's a lot of good arguments to say it would be a regressive move to try and sweep mandatory BNG into this system, and that there is nothing in the documentation that suggests that is the government's intention.
Rob, thanks for
never
that.
say never.
You've really clearly sort of set out there that at the moment, while it's possible, it's not likely that BNG is going to be swept into this. My question originally was rather more about the fact that, of course, if a farmer is selling their land for biodiversity net gain, then they are selling it at a higher value than they would be if there was a compulsory purchase order where they were effectively having to sell that land at agricultural value. So I guess the question is, if farmers are concerned that they might might be sort of captured within this new approach because they're living in a catchment or near somewhere where nutrient loading is an issue, where it's known that there are particular challenges around protected species, etc. Would it be in their best interests to get in there early, to get in touch with habitat banks and try and get their land put into BNG schemes so that they can preempt what might happen and get their land sold for BNG credits at a higher value?
Okay, forgive me for not having got to the thrust of the question.
No, because it was still really important what you were saying.
So that speaks to the sort of the core principles of compulsory purchase and existing use value. So, which is that you've got to take the land that you're coming to compulsory purchase as you find it. Essentially, you pay for its existing use value, and that would include, if it had a planning permission for something, you've got to take account of the value associated with the planning permission. So your sort of logic runs that if the land was subject to an arrangement that was generating additional value because it was delivering against BNG, then that would have to be considered in the compulsory purchase. If you were partway through a conversation to do a deal, but you hadn't done a deal, then you're probably not getting enhanced value. But if you've got that the certainty of that revenue or that capital coming because you have a deal in place, then you are probably going to get the benefit of that value.
So is there an advantage to farmers in basically identifying the challenge and trying to sell their land at a higher value in advance of potential compulsory purchases?
I mean, perhaps, but I mean, first of all, I don't know that many people who are selling land for BNG. Most people are either leasing or selling credits through ongoing management of their land for BNG.
Sorry, that was me misspeaking. What I was meaning was putting their land into a management agreement where they are leasing that land for BNG credits. Would that, if it was in a BNG scheme, would that exclude it from being purchased within these new compulsory purchase arrangements, or would the land still get sold in that way?
If the land was a target for compulsory purchase and it was in a BNG scheme, the value that was paid for the compulsory purchase would reflect the fact that it was in a BNG scheme.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That's clear. That's great.
But I don't think we should be saying to people, take a speculative view that you're likely to be compulsory purchased and go and agree terms for BNG, because I think we're going to be I hope I'm not wrong. I think we're a way off broad swathes of farmland being compulsory purchased for this. I think that's going to be very specific when there is a need to assemble complicated parcels of land to make something very specific happen. I don't think it's going to be a broad brush approach.
Yeah. Okay. That's really clear, Rob. Thank you. And I think what you're essentially saying is, look, let's not do anything hastily. We have this piece of legislation. There are concerns. Let's take a step back. Let's see how things start to unfold, and then we'll be better informed in terms of making decisions as we go forward. But farmers aren't going to have their land taken off them in the next 6 months, so we don't need to panic at this stage. Gabriel, just a kind of last question to you, which is, government says that it's committed to growing the nature market, and the planning reform working paper says that we expect delivery bodies to ensure competition and innovation in securing impact and value. How does competition work in terms of decisions that are taken by Natural England about which farmland they're going to compulsorily purchase? Where is the competitive aspect in the supply chain?
I mean, I think if they're going down the CPO route, there probably isn't one, frankly. But I think it's key to recognise that that really will be a last resort, and I don't think that we are going to see them kind of not imminently needing to go and start doing that as an approach to deliver these policy proposals, because even if they're the ones that are basically trying to deliver everything themselves, as long as they get the tariffs right, then it should still be an appealing thing for landowners to participate in the same way that nutrient neutrality schemes and other kind of environmental offsetting for protected species, which are more sort of specific requirements. But it's still worthwhile for a farmer to participate in those programs of work. So I think it's really key, and we've been trying to communicate this to government. I think a lot of other people who are involved in the space, actually, interestingly, across the kind of natural capital businesses and also third sector businesses, that I think are embracing the idea that nature markets are driving huge amounts of investment into doing nature restoration work. That it's really key that they don't go and take an approach that does fundamentally undermine the existing work that's going on with nature markets. And I think in general that is their intention. We're kind of getting strong signals that that's their intention. What we're not seeing is the way in which the bill is currently drafted doesn't suggest that that's necessarily actually having protections against undermining current nature markets approaches. So really we need to see much stronger wording within the bill, and also comms from government to say we still really are committed to a market-based approach to delivering these solutions. That is good for the rural economy. That also means that we can route money from one sector, private investment in one sector, into investment in another sector that's delivering nature restoration outcomes. And therefore we shouldn't hopefully need to go anywhere near this compulsory purchase option, because actually everyone's going to be wanting to participate in it.
And I think if you take a positive view, and you think about protected species, mitigating impacts to protected species, a lot of that work is being done on development sites now. A lot of that money to do that is being spent on the development sites. Well, this approach takes that money off the development sites and puts it into nature recovery sites. Now, if that is done through public-private partnership in terms of the delivery of that nature recovery, then that's bringing in an additional revenue stream and an additional set of nature recovery actions into the countryside space that currently isn't there.
Thanks so much. And Rob, just a final question back to you. Compulsory purchases, of course, aren't a new idea. It's just that they're now potentially going to be used as a mechanism for nature recovery as well. Can we learn anything from how CPOs have been used in the past? Will farmers have any scope for appeal, or once the decision has been taken, that's that?
Compulsory purchase is a painful process for all involved. It's long-winded. It's very process heavy. It's extremely uncomfortable and unpleasant, and it's to be avoided if at all possible. The ability of the person who's having their asset compulsory purchase to change the process, to appeal against values, to make things different is ultimately limited, and that's the point. The point is that the state needs the asset, and the state's going to have the asset. I've been involved in various schemes, road schemes, rail schemes, whatever. If you are subject to an interest that's leading to compulsory purchase, my best advice to you is to have your practical discussions as early as possible. This train is coming. You can't take the train off the track, but for goodness sake, try and make sure that you've got the bridges you need, the underpasses you need, you get whatever benefits you can from the way that it's being delivered. You're part of the delivery if at all possible, because there are ways of making it less worse, but there aren't ways of stopping it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, both of you. That's all we have time for. And I guess what I'm taking away from this conversation is that, there is a concern. It is something which is being flagged and being discussed within the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. But from farmers' listening perspective, they shouldn't be doing anything immediate. We don't yet know how this is going to play out. And there will be more information coming out across the next few months and even years as this starts to be embedded. So wait and see. And compulsory purchase orders, they are a mechanism of last resort, and hopefully they will remain being used as a mechanism of last resort, and other mechanisms may well be used, or tried at an earlier stage before they're applied. So just don't do anything too fast, and watch this space. I'd like to thank my guests, Gabriel Connor-Streich from Greenshank Environmental and Rob Hindle from Rural Solutions. If you haven't yet listened to our first episode of our new series, Farmgate Leaders, please do take time to search it out. Sheila Hancock, the chief executive of First Milk, talks about her early life in Northern Ireland, about championing regenerative dairy, and about promoting women in agriculture. And if you scroll back through your Farmgate podcast menu, you'll also find episodes from our Filling the Funding Gap series and our Wheat from the Chaff series too. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.